So today we are reviewing an investment strategy memo analyzing the survival challenges of AI competitors, specifically looking at the July 2026 EU mandate opening up Google, the release of Moonshot AI's Kimi K3, and small business adoption hurdles. And jumping right in, the material has a strong foundational grasp of the current news cycle, but it really needs to align more aggressively with its target audience of professional investors right out of the gate.
The analysis of the EU mandate against Google successfully identifies the regulatory shift, but stops short of defining the critical market impact for professional investors. Because the weakness here is that the draft treats the opening of Android and search as this, blanket victory for all AI competitors.
Right.
And it entirely fails to differentiate between the massive incumbents who actually have the infrastructure to absorb this data and the smaller independent models who might, still really struggle to monetize or utilize it.
Yeah. Reading that section detailing how the EU is forcing Google to share its search data and its Android integration capabilities with rivals, the memo seems to view this as a pure democratization event.
Mm-hmm.
The implication is that removing the barrier allows competitors to work just as smoothly as built-in assistants. But looking at the actual mechanics of data ingestion, I have a question.
Sure.
Is forcing open a walled garden really like tearing down a dam, where data just floods the market equally for everyone? Because to me, it strikes me as being much closer to laying a massive, high-pressure pipeline.
Oh, that is a fantastic analogy. Yeah.
Right? Only the giant incumbents who already possess the computational infrastructure can actually attach a valve to that pipeline and process what is flowing out of it without everything exploding.
Exactly. Which is why my suggestion is to shift the focus from the legal and operational outcome of the ruling to the specific market friction it removes. You have to define exactly which tier of AI competitor stands to capture the most market share as a result.
Right? Because raw data isn't just magic.
No, not at all. If we analyze the financial mechanics, raw data is essentially a liability until you have the CapEx to process it.
Yeah.
So an investor needs to know how this pipeline changes the unit economics of the specific companies they're evaluating.
Well, think about a mid-tier AI company. If they suddenly gain access to Google's real-time search index, their historical customer acquisition cost, or their data scraping budget, it drops dramatically.
Oh, it plummets.
Right. But then their compute costs, like their AWS or Azure bills, those are going to completely skyrocket because they now have to index and contextualize that massive influx of live data.
Precisely. The bottleneck didn't disappear. It just moved. It moved from data access to compute CapEx.
Yeah.
So instead of concluding that competitors can work as smoothly as built-in assistants, the writer needs to map out a specific investment thesis. As a concrete example, create a matrix evaluating how access to Google search data alters the valuation of mid-tier AI companies versus giant hyperscalers like Microsoft.
Oh, that's interesting.
And furthermore, recommend exploring whether this ruling makes independent AI models prime acquisition targets for hardware companies who are looking to bypass Google's ecosystem.
Wait, I want to challenge the logistics of that hardware M&A thesis slightly.
Okay, go for it.
Are we assuming that, a Dell or a Samsung actually wants to take on the massive margin compression of running a foundational AI model just because the Android ecosystem is now forced open?
Because historically, hardware manufacturers avoid software margin structures. The operational costs are entirely foreign to their business models,
It is a totally valid skepticism. 100%. But we have to look at the defensive posturing of those hardware companies.
Okay. They don't necessarily want to run the models to generate software revenue, right? They want to own the models to stop paying the massive licensing premiums to Google and Microsoft.
Ah, I see.
Yeah. If the EU mandate allows deep integration at the OS level, a hardware manufacturer can acquire a mid-tier AI company, integrate it natively into their devices as the default assistant, and bypass the Google tax completely.
So the AI model just becomes a loss leader to drive hardware sales.
Exactly. It's a loss leader, and the memo really needs to highlight this because it fundamentally changes the valuation multiples of those mid-tier AI companies.
Right, because they are no longer being valued on their recurring software revenue.
Nope. They are being valued on their strategic value as a bypass mechanism.
Which means the mandate doesn't just create a level playing field, it creates an entirely new category of distressed or opportunistic assets.
Yes.
Because if the EU mandate solves the data starvation problem, it just accelerates the commodification of the data itself, which means the battlefield shifts entirely to processing capability and, honestly, more importantly, placement.
And speaking of placement and surviving in that battlefield, that brings us to the next section. The coverage of Moonshot AI's Kimi K3 relies too heavily on technical capabilities rather than strategic market positioning.
Yeah, I noticed that too.
The weakness in this next section is that emphasizing K3 as simply a smarter successor to K2 reads way more like a consumer product brochure than an actual analysis of how a new model survives in an incredibly crowded post-regulation landscape.
Right, like listing out features.
Exactly. Emphasizing its ability to process incredibly long documents and highly complex tasks, that is a technical observation, not a survival strategy.
We see this constantly in technical memos, though. The race for the longest context window and the most sophisticated reasoning, it just gets treated as the finish line. But I have to ask, does competing on pure technical specs, like longer document processing, even matter if a model doesn't own the distribution channels we just talked about?
Honestly, no.
It's like building the world's fastest bullet train is entirely irrelevant if you haven't secured the rights to lay the track.
Oh, that's exactly it. A 1 million token context window is a massive technical achievement, sure, but without a captive user base, it is just a very, very expensive science experiment burning through server time.
Yeah, burning cash.
So my suggestion here is to evaluate the K3 release cycle specifically through the lens of competitive survival and defensive moats. You have to analyze how its specific capabilities can actually be weaponized against both big tech and other startups.
Because professional investors are highly cynical about spec sheets.
Oh, absolutely. They know that whatever technical advantage K3 has today, an open-source alternative or a hyperscaler like Meta or Microsoft will likely replicate it within, 6 months?
Yeah, probably less.
So the analysis must pivot from what the model can do to how hard it will be for competitors to dislodge it once it is actually deployed.
So the analysis needs to look at the B2B utility of that specific architecture. Like, if K3 is optimized for massive document retrieval, we shouldn't be evaluating it as a general-purpose chatbot.
Right.
Like fighting for screen time against a native Android assistant asking for recipes or whatever. We should be evaluating it as a specialized industrial tool.
Exactly. So for a concrete example, frame K3's long document capability against the newly opened Android ecosystem we just discussed. Can Moonshot bypass Google's native AI to become the default enterprise research tool on mobile devices?
That's a great angle.
And beyond that, suggest advising investors to look at K3's partnership strategies. Things like integrating directly into B2B financial or legal platforms, rather than fighting a losing consumer war against built-in assistants.
Let's pull on that thread regarding legal and financial platforms for a second, because I think that's super interesting.
Yeah, let's do it.
If Moonshot takes K3 and embeds it deeply into the proprietary software that law firms use to parse, say, 50,000-page discovery caches.
They bypass the consumer app store entirely.
Completely.
They don't need millions of casual users asking it to write poetry. They need 10,000 corporate lawyers relying on it for complex contract analysis. And sure, the token generation cost is immense for those big files, but the B2B willingness to pay scales with it.
And that is exactly where the defensibility lies. If K3 secures exclusive distribution within specialized legal software, they essentially create a localized monopoly.
Right.
Even if Microsoft releases a model next year with a slightly larger context window, a massive law firm isn't going to rip out their entire enterprise software stack just for a marginal spec upgrade.
Oh, definitely not. The downtime alone would cost them millions. Exactly. The switching costs become way too high. So the strategy memo needs to articulate that K3's survival doesn't actually depend on its intelligence, but on its integration friction. The harder it is to remove, the higher its valuation.
But securing that track in an enterprise environment brings up a pretty harsh operational reality, doesn't it?
It really does.
You can integrate a highly capable model into a platform, but the end user still has to actually use it in their daily workflow.
Right.
Which brings us to the final section of the memo, discussing the operational reality of small businesses struggling with AI implementation gaps. The material notes that businesses are still struggling to figure out how to use these models for real work.
Yes, the infamous implementation gap.
Right, and I want to push back on the underlying premise the draft relies on here. Isn't implementation gap just a polite, industry-approved euphemism for a technology that hasn't found genuine product-market fit outside of a few niche enterprise use cases?
Oh, that's a sharp way to look at it.
Right? I mean, if thousands of small businesses are struggling to figure out how to use a tool, perhaps the problem isn't their lack of understanding. Perhaps the problem is that the API requires a level of behavioral change that fundamentally breaks their existing workflows.
The discussion surrounding small business implementation gaps accurately diagnoses an operational reality, but fails to translate this pain point into an actionable investment strategy.
Yeah,
Because the weakness here is that by framing the struggles solely as an end-user failure to adopt this everywhere AI, the material entirely misses the opportunity to advise professional investors on where the next wave of capital should flow to solve this exact problem.
right. Identifying that businesses are confused by raw API access is certainly true.
Yeah, of course it is.
But stopping the analysis there leaves the investor totally empty-handed. We need to look at the mechanics of how, like, a 50-person logistics company actually adopts new technology.
Right. They aren't tech companies.
Exactly. They are running on legacy SQL databases and 15-year-old routing software. You cannot simply hand them a foundational model API key and expect their operations manager to build a secure, robust integration.
No, it's never going to happen. So the suggestion for the writer is to reposition this operational hurdle as a distinct, lucrative market category. You need to advise investors to look for companies solving the integration problem rather than just looking at those building the foundational models.
Because the foundational models are engaged in a race to the bottom, right?
Completely. Regarding inference costs, they are commoditizing intelligence. But the companies that sit between that commoditized intelligence and the messy, disorganized data of a legacy small business, that is where the massive software as a service margins are currently hiding.
It is essentially the need for a universal translator at a global summit.
I love that. Yes.
Like, the foundational models speak raw computational logic, and the small business speaks localized idiosyncratic workflows. The companies building the translator interfaces are the ones capturing the actual recurring revenue. The foundational model does all the heavy lifting, but the translator owns the client relationship.
Exactly. So for concrete examples, the writer should replace the generic takeaway about businesses just needing to figure it out with a highly targeted thesis on AI middleware.
AI middleware, okay.
Yeah.
Suggest highlighting specialized consultancies, user interface layers, or vertically integrated software companies that bridge the gap between complex models and legacy small business workflows as prime M&A targets for investors.
Okay, but I do wonder about the long-term defensibility of that middleware layer.
Okay, what's your concern there?
Well, historically, relying on building a UI wrapper around someone else's API is incredibly dangerous.
Right, the wrapper problem. Yeah, because whenever the foundational model decides to update their own native interface, they can just obliterate the middleware companies overnight by simply offering the integrations for free. So does advising investors to pour capital into middleware ignore the platform risk?
It's a great question, but that platform risk really only exists if the middleware is just a thin chat interface. True enterprise middleware is sticky.
Sticky how?
Because it handles the unglamorous, highly specific data schema translations that foundational models actively want to avoid.
Ah, right.
Like a company like OpenAI or Moonshot wants high-margin compute volume. They do not want the low-margin nightmare of doing custom security compliance and localized database integrations for 10,000 different regional logistics firms.
No, that sounds like a logistical nightmare for a hyperscaler.
Exactly. The middleware companies build deep hooks into the on-premise servers. They handle the role-based access controls. They provide the audit logs that regulators need.
Right, all the boring stuff.
Exactly. All the boring stuff. And that is a highly defensible moat because the big tech players view that work as a massive distraction, whereas the middleware companies view it as their core product.
See, that distinction is exactly the kind of alpha-generating insight this memo needs to deliver. It transforms the implementation gap from a generic industry complaint into a highly targeted acquisition strategy. It tells the investor to stop looking at the companies burning billions on server farms and start looking at the quiet, high-margin SaaS companies that are solving the last-mile delivery problem for enterprise AI.
And doing that creates a cohesive, causal narrative across the entire document.
Yeah, it ties it all together.
Right. We start with the EU mandate physically altering the flow of data and changing the CapEx requirements for mid-tier models. Then we move to how those models, like K3, must then abandon the consumer spec sheet war and secure B2B distribution just to survive. And finally, we arrive at the realization that the actual integration of those models requires a dedicated middleware layer, which presents the most immediate opportunity for capital deployment.
So, to summarize the core editorial focus for the next draft, the analysis must continuously move beyond summarizing technological shifts and relentlessly pursue the financial mechanics behind them.
Yes.
Map the regulatory unlocking of Google's data directly to the unit economics and the hardware M&A potential of mid-tier AI companies. Evaluate Kimi K3 strictly based on its capacity for vertical B2B integration rather than its processing specs, and reframe the small business adoption gap as the primary driver for a lucrative AI middleware investment thesis.
The foundation of this research is incredibly solid, I really mean that. But the execution just needs to ruthlessly prioritize the how and the why over the what. Professional investors don't need help reading the news. They need help modeling the friction points that those news events create.
Absolutely. We invite you to revise your strategy memo based on this critique and submit it back for further review. When you push past the technical brochures and focus strictly on market survival and capital flow, the resulting analysis becomes truly indispensable. Until next time.